is very real. The CDC reports that 63% of 18 to 24-year-olds have reported symptoms of anxiety or depression because of the pandemic. So tonight, a chance for some real talk about how all of us can better cope with this year of extraordinary loss. Joining with me, grief therapist Claire Bidwell Smith. She is the author of Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. Good to see you. The Washington Post grief and loss coach Hope Edelman writes that pandemic grief could become its own health crisis. She also talks about grief being cyclical, especially around anniversaries. We have all lost so much. What do we need to be thinking about as we relive the month marking when just about everything changed?
I think that there's so much that's going to come up for all of us around this time. I think, reaching that 1 year mark causes all of us to reflect on the last year, and I don't think there's anyone who hasn't gone through some form of loss, whether it's the loss of a job or kids being home from school, health, employment, so many things that I think every American and every citizen in the world has struggled with, which in some ways is important that we've all begun to talk about grief and loss in a bigger way, and I think that that is going to be one of the ways that we come through and start to heal this. But I really think that as we start to come out of quarantine, as the vaccines start to roll out, as we start to go back to normal life, we're going to see a new wave of grief. Often we don't feel fully able to grieve until we feel safe. And so I think when we start feeling safe again and back to normal, we're going to see more grief.
Right, you can't process a trauma while you're going through it. Your book addresses the connections between anxiety and grief, which I don't think people often think of as existing in tandem. How do we identify those feelings in ourselves and in people we love?
Anxiety shows up in lots of ways. It has a lot of physical symptoms, which can be very misleading. Often people will think that there is something wrong with them when they're having feelings of a panic attack, heart palpitations, sweating. But anxiety also shows up in hypochondria, it shows up in social problems, social anxiety. And I think that it's a very slippery thing that people can often hide. So I think talking about it more, letting people know that it's okay to feel anxiety, letting people know that it's okay to look for support, and letting people know that it is a part of grief. When we go through a big loss or a trauma like we all have in this last year, it is really natural for a certain level of anxiety to come up.
Can you talk us through the health consequences of not addressing grief? What could we be seeing as far as grief becoming sort of the next health crisis that America needs to contend with?
A lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of substance abuse, relationship issues. I think that Hope is absolutely right. It could become its own health crisis, and I think that's what we will see in some of this fallout from the pandemic. There was a study recently that showed that for every one person who has died of COVID, there are 9 people in mourning, which means that there are 4.5 million people in this country alone who are grieving. And I think that there's not enough support for that. I don't think people always know where to turn to look for it. And I don't think people always feel permission to feel grief, especially when it's a more ambiguous loss.
Right. I also don't know that people have literally been given the space to grieve, right? I mean, so many rituals that surround death and loss have been lost to this pandemic because we have not been able to be together with those we love, to process it. What then does it look like to do that on the other side of this as we come out of quarantine?
Right, I mean, those things of not being able to process it, not being able to be with our loved ones at the time of death, not being able to have funerals, sit Shiva, that lends itself to a more complicated form of grief, which often displays in a kind of extended period, if anything. And I think we're going to see a lot of extended grief. Thankfully, we have a president who understands grief. I can't imagine having a better leader at this time. I think that he will be able to make space for all the grief that needs to happen. He will be recognizing it. I'm really hopeful that he will be putting things in place to offer more support. So that gives me a lot of relief about how we're going to support each other through this next health crisis.
It is a tall order, Claire. I am so grateful for your expertise. Thank you. At the top of the hour, it's The Week with Joshua Jones.